What's going on, everybody? Thank you all for joining me today. If you haven't already, please make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're new to the channel, and most importantly, please make sure you follow me on Telegram at TD Media Group to help circumvent social media censorship and shadow banning. And with the introduction out of the way, let's get into today's news. And today, we have to go back and revisit the PR nightmare created by Joe Biden once he pardoned his son, Hunter Biden, because the DNC and their media affiliates have been scrambling to stomp out this fire ever since that happened. And they are now being forced to admit that the hush money trial, the indictment in Georgia, and the federal indictment was all lawfare. Yes, it was all lawfare, and that it was all politically motivated. And recently, when Senator John Fetterman was on The View, he even went as far as to say that Trump himself should be pardoned. And you can just tell that this killed Joy on the inside, because she was the one that brought it up to John, to which she then would respond by talking about January 6th, because when in doubt, I don't know, blames Trump and bring up January 6ers, to which Fetterman actually brushed that to the side and just basically admitted the fact that the DNC were too gleeful to do victory laps around Donald Trump being now considered a 34-time felon, and now have to admit that what happened to him indeed was wrong, and it was political persecution.
So, Senator, President Biden's decision to pardon his son Hunter is facing bipartisan backlash. Even the Democrats are all over it. But what do you think? Is this much ado about nothing? It is his son, after all, and people do have sympathy for that. But a lot of people are angry with him about it. What do you say?
Oh, well, I think it's undeniable that the case against Hunter Biden was really politically motivated, but I also think it's true that the trial in New York for Trump that was political as well too. Now is that, and in both cases, I think a pardon is appropriate, and I really think collectively, America's confidence in these kinds of institutions have been damaged by these kinds of cases, and we cannot allow these kinds of institutions to be weaponized against our political opponents. And it's very clear both trials were politically motivated and weaponized that on the other side.
They'll say that about the J6 people too, though, right? That's what they're going to say on the other side. That is weaponized also.
I'm not referring to that. I'm talking about the New York trial. And now the Democrats on our side there were some that were gleeful, calling it like, now he's a convicted felon and those things. And now for our party, we were talking about criminal justice, and we are now talking about second chances. And now all of a sudden now you're like, well, he's a convicted felon and all these things. And now clearly, again, both of those trials, the Hunter Biden one and the trial in New York for Trump, that was politically motivated. And those kinds of charges would have never been brought unless one side could realize that they could weaponize that.
Wow.
See, I want to highlight something that he stated there coming towards the end. And this is something that I've discussed maybe one or two times before, but I'm glad that he stated this, because it really highlights the hypocrisy of the DNC and how they will do anything to win, despite the fact that it all backfired in their face and they lost miserably in this year's election. But he stated that their party was the party of criminal justice reform and second chances. Do you remember that, especially coming off of the whole George Floyd situation? And then what came about was that Joe Biden was supposed to pass, I think it was called the George Floyd Justice and Reform Bill, if I'm not mistaken. They were all about criminal justice reform. They were all about second chances, and you having a felony that shouldn't affect you from getting a job and being able to get an apartment when you're doing a background check. They were for all of these things, and at the drop of a dime turned into the law is the law. No one's above the law. It doesn't matter who you are, even if you're a former president. But Joe Biden destroyed that narrative, completely ripped it to shreds the moment that the law was no longer the law and does not apply to me when you're the president's son. So I just wanted to highlight that point because once again, I thought that that's very interesting because the hypocrisy in that the party that was once for criminal justice reform is now all about law and order was just an excellent thing for him to highlight. And it highlights the great hypocrisy of the DNC. Now, what I want to do is that I want to go over to what Stephen A. Smith had to say as he was speaking with Cuomo on News Nation. Let's jump into some of his statements right now.
Nobody would blame him for that. But that's not where he went. So I didn't have a problem to answer your question directly with the decision that he made to pardon his son. Boo Boo the Fool knew he was going to do that. I don't care who he stood in front of or sat in front of and said that he wasn't going to pardon his son and he was just going to go by the letter of the law. Please, everybody and their grandmother knew he was going to pardon his son. But to come out and to start talking about how it's been a witch hunt and the Department of Justice and others were after him or whoever it was and, GOP rather was after him. Well, wait a minute. What have y'all been doing with Donald Trump all of these years? Now, you can make an argument about the legitimacy of the cases against Donald Trump compared to what wasn't legitimate, etc. That's not the point. The point is it was clearly politicized. You had folks on the left who were hell-bent on going after Donald Trump because they were determined to make sure that he couldn't run for re-election or that these elements would get in the way of him possibly winning re-election. And now we know why more than ever, because they weren't confident they would ever be able to beat him. And so for him to come out and to talk about that this was a witch hunt when clearly it could be argued that's exactly what you were doing to Donald Trump or you assisted in doing seems beyond hypocritical. And that was what disgusted me. It wasn't his decision. It wasn't him pardoning his son. It was the weak, pathetic explanation that he gave, which has most critics just shaking their heads and raising their eyebrows and saying, what nerve you have.
And the reason they're shaking their heads and raising their eyebrows and saying what nerve you had is because the way that this is all backfired on the narratives that they love to speak on Donald Trump. And this is backfiring now on Joe Biden so bad that it's even looking like the donors who are going to help fund his presidential library might be pulling back their funds. It doesn't mean that his library won't be constructed, but there might be a slight delay when the funds are kind of being held up and tied up because your donors are pissed off that you really messed things up for the party. This article title reads, Biden Library reportedly under threat by Democrats enraged by Hunter pardon. Senior Democrats are reportedly considering withholding contributions to Joe Biden's future presidential library amid a mounting backlash over his decision to grant a blanket pardon to his son Hunter. The threat has emerged as simmering anger among congressional Democrats has burst into the open over Sunday's pardon, which Biden had previously vowed not to give. Axios reported that the party grandees were considering taking out their rage on Biden's library project. Presidential libraries, a tradition that began by Franklin D. Roosevelt, are generally funded by a combination of private donors, state and local governments, and university partners. Maintained by the National Archives and Records Administration, they are used to house presidents' papers and documents after they leave office. A source familiar with Biden's project played down the possibility of donations being withheld, telling Axios the sentiment hasn't come up in a single donor conversation and work is well underway. But can you really believe that coming from a Biden insider, a source familiar with the Biden project, not a source that's actively part of working on it, just someone who's familiar? We don't know who that is. I don't know who they're talking about. But what I do know is that Joe Biden's a liar. And anything coming from him and coming from his camp and essentially coming from the DNC at this point that may appear to be defending him, it all has to be taken with a grain of salt now because you're most likely lying. And this is the great damage that Joe Biden has done to the DNC. Credibility completely shot. And with all that being said, that does it for today's news. I want to thank you all for joining me today. Subscribe to the channel if you're new to the channel. Share this video on your social media platforms. And once again, don't forget to follow me on Telegram and Rumble at TD Media Group. Both the link to my Telegram and Rumble will be in the description box below and pinned in the comment section as well. Thank you all for your time. Until the next video, peace and have a great afternoon.